It's working, yes. And
David Weisglass, thank you so much for joining us tonight on topics that are of interest and concern to us and help us to do our jobs better. So please go ahead. Thank you so much. David, may I ask you, would you prefer questions along the way, or would you prefer questions at the end of your presentation?
I'm lucky enough to have two screens here, so I should be able to do a little multitasking, but feel free I'll try to stop at certain intervals for questions about, the last couple slides. But I think maybe we could do that. Feel free to just type your questions into the question or the chat or whatever as you go. I don't, maybe I'm projecting, but I know myself, a lot of times I'll have a question, I'll forget it in a minute. So feel free to just put them in the chat as you go. And then I'll try to answer them as we go. And if I don't get them, then I'll do it at the end for sure.
Thank you very much.
All right. We all ready?
Yes, David, you should be able to share your screen.
All right. Hold on just a minute. All right, share this screen and slideshow, view show from the beginning. All right, we're doing well?
We are.
All right, sounds good. All right, well, hello, everybody. My name is David Weisglass. I've met a few of you previously before we went on our summer break. I welcome you all back, but I know I haven't met everyone. So I just want to say hello to everyone. I'll first kind of do a quick introduction to myself, and then we'll go into the zoning, then kind of what a land use application actually is for the applications that'll come before the committee and the complete board. And then at the end, just a little bit, how can DCP support you is more of the Q&A part, right? That's where I want to hear a little bit from you. But obviously, we'll go into more of that later on. I only have a limited time here, so this is kind of just 101 stuff. Introduction to myself. I have been with the department for almost a year and a half now. I started a little over a year and a half, somewhere in that range. Year and a quarter, we'll split the difference. I'm originally from New Jersey in Monmouth County. For those of you familiar, I got an undergrad and master's degree in planning at the University of Southern California. I was working in the San Francisco planning department for about 5 years. So Ibrahim, not to call you out, but I see their background and I'm a big fan. And then I moved, I'd like to say back to New York, but of course I'm not a real New Yorker. I'm a New Jersey person, but I do love New York. It's where I fell in love with planning. It's kind of the first conception of what a city really was. And since beginning to work with CB10 and getting more involved, I've really come to love the district quite a bit. And so I'm really happy to be the liaison to this community district. All right. Okay, a little bit of background. So what is zoning? Zoning is a law that organizes how land is used and established. It has to be kind of in a pattern and part of what we call a well-considered plan. And that's actually required by the charter. And it's a tool to plan for the future of communities, right? It can reflect political assumptions and political goals, sure, sometimes, but really that's not the main issue. The main issue is what we're trying to do is plan for the future of the way I like to say it, use and space of land, right? What is the land use? What can I do with this land? What's allowed to be there? And then regulating space, right? It's not only space on the ground of the actual land itself, but also vertical space, right? Air rights and an airspace above your property. How tall can you build? Can you build straight up? Can you build spires? Whatever it is. So really, it just comes down to regulating those two concepts, right? And again, it's a valuable limited resource, right? And so how are we going to use that resource to make sure that the community plans for its future in a well-considered way, and that the community kind of plays its role in the larger city, in the larger regional area in a well-considered manner, right? Land isn't really much of a limited resource when you think of it in the grand scheme of things, but in terms of land within the city, near job centers, near places of commerce, near places that people want to shop and live and be among their friends, land is a very valuable resource and it's limited, right? And so we want to make sure that we can plan for that effectively. All right, New York State enables zoning, right? But it can only enable zoning if it's in accordance with a well-considered plan. You've heard me say that a number of times, and that's in the charter. That is legally binding. It needs to be well-considered. It cannot be kind of haphazard and random. It needs to be rational. It needs to be well-justified, right? It cannot benefit a single property owner, right? That's something that is known in law circles as spot zoning, right? And that's not part of a well-considered plan. If you're just looking at this one property owner, that's favoritism that looks at the private sector and says, you're allowed to do this because you're powerful or something. That's not allowed. It needs to be part of a comprehensive plan or a well-considered plan. It needs to comply with SECRA, right? And that's basically the environmental requirements, and it requires taking a hard look at the potential environmental impacts and what alternatives might occur if we don't take these actions. Environmental impacts, some of them are obvious, right? What impacts does it have on the soil beneath? What impacts does it have on our air quality? Some of them are a little bit less obvious. There are impacts on historic resources that fall under this category as well. There are shadow impacts and wind impacts that fall under the category of environmental review. So that's all important. And basically, the city's zoning plan, or I mean, planning is much more than zoning, but the zoning plan or whatever kind of rezonings or certifications or actions need to satisfy all three of these. And that is required by the law. All right, zoning in New York City, let's get into it. So this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? It really is about use and space, height and bulk of our buildings and whatever other structures you have. That is all regulating space, right? That's space not only on the land, what kind of front yards do you need to have, side yards do you need to have in this district, rear yards, but also vertical space, right? How tall can you build? How close to your neighbors can you build? If your building next door is really tall, can I build that tall? It depends, it's all that kind of stuff as well. Yards, courts, other open spaces, again, space. Density of population. There's also that kind of, in my mind, falls under the category of use, right? Can we use this property for only a single family home? Are we allowed to build an apartment building? Are we allowed to build a duplex? Things like that. Location of trades and industries, again, land use. Can I only build a residence here, or am I allowed to have a business? Am I allowed to have a community facility? Am I allowed to build industry here or manufacturing here? And locations of buildings designated for specific uses, right? Where are schools permitted, right? Where are our other kind of important community infrastructure elements permitted, and where are they required to go? Zoning rules apply to zoning lots, right? And zoning lots, or sorry about that. Yeah, zoning rules apply to zoning lots, which are generally coterminous with tax lots, but not always, right? Zoning rules don't apply necessarily the same way city streets are used. That's regulated by DOT, or to the parkland, which is regulated by the Department of Parks and Recreation. So for example, sometimes we'll receive calls that commercial vehicles are parked on streets within residential zoning districts, but unfortunately the rules on the road are dictated by DOT, right? We're regulating mostly private property when it comes to zoning, and that's what we're talking about here. The state of New York is also allowed to override local zoning rules, usually for development on state-owned land, right? And finally, private property may have private restrictions that apply to their land, sometimes restrictive covenants that prohibit a particular use or something like that. Those are civil arrangements. Basically, private arrangements usually, they're not enforced by the Department of Buildings. So there are other rules that come into this, but that's kind of the general gist of zoning, is regulating use and space, right? Let me stop there real quick and see if anyone has any questions. My two screens aren't exactly quite doing the job, but I can see what I can do. Questions? Going once, going twice. All right, beautiful. Moving right along.
Oh, Anne has a question.
Oh.
She has her hand raised. Maybe, David, if it's easier, could we stop the share screen and then start it again after questions?
Sure,
So we could see everyone? It's hard to see that. Okay,
of
Ann.
course.
David, how often does the Planning Commission review the zoning as it exists? Or are changes basically spurred by the planning boards and others? Or is that constant reviewing and reassessing done in-house?
So there's not a constant scheduled review of like a citywide plan, if that's what you mean.
Yeah.
New York is a little bit unique. This is delving a little bit outside zoning, but it still very much applies. New York City, which some of you know, is a little unique among large American cities in that we do not have what's called a comprehensive plan or a general plan. Which kind of sounds crazy when you think about it. For instance, every city in the state of California is required by state law to have a general plan, which doesn't go down to the nitty gritty of what each lot zoning district is, but it still kind of gives a general framework. And a lot of those situations, they're required by state law, for instance, to look at the, city's general plan every 8 years, 10 years, 15 years. New York City does not have that requirement. When there are changes to zoning, they're spurred by an application, but those applications can be either private applications or publicly sponsored applications, which I'll get to a little bit later. The majority of them are private applications for rezonings, in which private applicants will request rezoning applications. But they still need to satisfy everything I talked about here. They still need to be part of a well-considered plan, so on and so forth. But there's also public applications that will actually have the city and the Department of City Planning as the main applicant. There are yet other applications, typically not for rezonings, but occasionally for rezonings in which another city agency is requesting it. For example, the Department of Housing, Preservation and Development is sometimes the applicant when they are trying to develop some affordable housing or work with a nonprofit to develop affordable housing. And they will be the applicant, but we kind of treat it all the same. Regardless of the applicant is, we need to review that, but there's not an ongoing review that's required every couple of years of the existing zoning.
Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. All right, let's get back to it. All right, we can see the screen. Thumbs up. Great. Where was I? Here we go. All right, this is the fun stuff. Basic zoning terms. This is a big one. So FAR, floor area ratio. This is one of those that's really hard to describe without visuals. So glad that we have it. FAR, you're going to hear a lot if you haven't already, if you're kind of new to the land use conversation. So it's basically your zoning lot area at the top in blue I'm reading, times your FAR is the square footage you can build. And it's kind of that simple, but you can see in the illustrations below what you have, right? So let's say you own a 10,000 square foot lot or zoning lot. I could talk about the difference between a zoning lot and a tax lot a little bit more later if we need to. 10,000 square foot lot that you own, and it has a 2.0 FAR. That means that you're allowed to build 20,000 square feet of floor area in your building on that lot. But the organization can kind of be whatever you want in theory. We have other regulations, but if I introduced a brand new city and in that brand new city, that's hypothetical city, I only had one bulk regulation, and that was FAR. There was no yard regulations or setback regulations. Then you could do whatever you wanted within that envelope, kind of. You could build, a 2-story building that covers the entire lot, as we see in kind of the second panel. You could build a 4-story building. You could build whatever kind of organization you want, as long as you build no more than 20,000 square feet. Heck, you can even build, 1 square foot going up and up and up and up and up until you get to 20,000. But that doesn't exactly make sense. But in theory, that's what you could do if FAR was kind of your only regulation, right? But that's a big one that you're going to see a lot. These are 2 terms that have been introduced basically to the zoning resolution over the years, right? 1961 is a big year to remember in the history of New York City planning. That's when we basically rezoned the entire city. That's when all the zoning that, the districts, a lot of the texts, all of that kind of came to be kind of organized in 1961. And that's what you see on the right side of your screen now. But these districts were what we call now non-contextual, right? They didn't necessarily have things fitting into a context. And of course, the city was relatively well developed by that time. You were allowed to build towers that didn't exactly meet the same bulk requirements as the buildings around you. As you can see here, they had different envelopes. They had a lot more flexibility no matter what area of the city you were in. What we saw was that tended to sometimes produce buildings that were not really necessarily out of context in terms of how tall they are or whatever, but in terms of just continuing a street wall, for instance, or maintaining consistent setbacks, right? As you see on some of your streets, you'll have consistent setbacks, right? Consistently sized front yards or side yards, consistent patterns that really make it, that area beautiful. And that's what you see in 1987 when we introduced quality housing in what we call contextual districts. So today in New York City, you'll see both non-contextual districts, where those are districts that are either left over from 1961, they have not been touched, they have been, remained since 1961 or soon thereafter. And then you'll also see contextual districts, right? And you tend to see a lot more contextual districts. When we rezone, much of the time, you'll see that we're rezoning with contextual districts. But there are some times we'll rezone with non-contextual districts because maybe it's in an odd area of the city where there's not a lot of context or to match, or it's a place that's previously, not been developed at all, and it's kind of creating its own context, or in an oddly shaped lot or something. All right. And we will see in a minute how to discern between these two districts or types of districts. All right. Building envelope. This is the important one as well. I'm saying that for all of them now, I realize. So starting at the right side, non-contextual districts, right? We call them height factor buildings as well. The envelope is a little funky because there is what we call a base plane, and we'll go over that a little bit. That's where you see kind of that front wall on the right side, that right image there. And then it slopes backwards until it meets kind of your rear wall there. That's called a sky exposure plane, and that's how we determine what can be built there. You could see that the actual building produced there has those like step backs, kind of that wedding cake shape that you see so much of around the city. And there's a reason for that, right? On the left side, contextual districts don't have that exposure plane. They've got what we call base heights and max heights. And then there's usually a setback in between. So we still kind of create that setback type building, but in those contextual districts, they fit a little bit more into the context because they're more specific about the maximum height you can have. And they're a little bit more tightly regulated. So here's our street walls. Some of the terms I just said here, you can see illustrated, right? Here's the street wall at the very front of your property line, basically. That's your base height. That can be a minimum or a maximum, right? Sometimes we want the base height to be at least this tall because usually it's in a district in which the neighboring buildings are, somewhere like that. We don't want it to be kind of all over the place. And then a max height, right? On the right side, you can see that here, there we go. That's what I'm looking for. On the right side, you can see in blue, that's the sky exposure plane. And depending on what district you're in, there's different types of slopes that can be allowed there. Right. In a low scale district, that slope might be 1-to-1. In a really central district in Manhattan or something, or downtown Brooklyn, that slope can be, closer to 4-to-1. So you can actually go up much steeper, kind of like what you see in this theoretical thing here. On the left side, the contextual districts, it's a lot simpler. There's a simple setback. It needs to be at least 10 feet or 15 feet or 20 feet, depending on your district. And then you can rise to your maximum height. In the non-contextual buildings on the right, you actually have not really a specific max height. I think it kind of just depends on how it works out with your exposure plane, right? Wherever those two meet. But you do have an open space ratio, right? And that says basically your building can only cover this much or this percentage of your ground floor. And you'll actually start to see these as you walk around the city. You'll see a lot of taller buildings that maybe are surrounded by open space, right? You'll see them in the tower and the park style developments of a lot of the NYCHA developments, but you'll also see them in individual buildings that are that were probably developed either before 1987 or since 1987 in those non-contextual districts, right? It'll be a building surrounded by this open space rather than kind of being right in that context like all the other ones around there, all right? Parking and loading, right? We kind of get the gist of it, but there's permitted parking and required parking, right? You have your required minimum parking spaces. You need to provide at least this many, depending on your district. And then there's your permitted. We actually have some parking maximums in some places of the city, right? Where we want to make sure our uses are for something a little bit more economically efficient and more productive, right? They can be open or enclosed. Some districts have requirements. Sometimes they have to be enclosed because we don't want these cars kind of, affecting our street view. And then there's different sizes of those parking spaces as well, right? Loading is part of that as well. You can see that in the bottom right, usually in industrial, commercial areas. Usually the developers will want to bring some loading anyway because they know, that will be required for the infrastructure to make sense, but we'll require those and we'll require different sizes depending on the use that you're providing. All right. One more time, I'm going to stop my share and ask if there are any questions. I see something in the chat.
Yes, there are 2 questions, I think, in the chat, David.
What's included and excluded from FAR in New York? And can you also let us know what's excluded from maximum height limits? Yes, I can. So what's included and excluded from FAR? It really does depend. And you can actually see this in the zoning resolution. I can send this afterwards. No one likes reading the ZR, but I was actually surprised at how simple it was.
Send it to us. It will be good to really get into the details.
Yes, I absolutely will. We have, and I'll get to this a little bit at the end. We have our zoning handbook, handy dandy zoning handbook. I have a book because I'm old fashioned like that, but it is for free downloadable online, and that puts everything into simple terms. And at the same time, if you're really nerdy about this stuff, there's no substitution for the actual zoning resolution. It is confusing, but it is really cool just to get like right from the horse's mouth, so to speak. What's included and excluded from FAR? I don't have it at the top of my head, but a lot of the extra space that's excluded and not part of the FAR could be something like stairwells in certain situations. Subterranean parking is not always included. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. So it does depend on the use. There's instances where we actually, in our definitions, have a difference between what a basement is and what a cellar is. And a basement counts, but a cellar doesn't count. So usually for FAR, what we're trying to count is the actual usable floor area, right? Where are you actually living or working or shopping? What's the actual floor area there, leaving out a lot of the excess space that's required for, I don't know, whether it be circulation. I mean, hallways are included, but kind of the infrastructure of the building that's not really usable. And that's the general gist of it. But to get into the specifics, I could send you some more information after that.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, happy to do it. And what's excluded from maximum height limits? There are what we call permitted obstructions that are permitted above the height limit. A lot of times those are elevator shafts, particularly if they're required, stairwells to get up to the roof, to work on the roof, especially if those are required. And sometimes just some extra things that are also allowed among the maximum height limit. And they're kind of in the same vein. We're not allowing extra height increases, or height increases just straight up aren't allowed for usable floor area necessarily, typically. Where you're actually making the bulk of the building taller for something that's not necessary or not helpful, if that makes any sense. Don't know all the specifics off the top of my head, but again, I can send this all to you afterwards.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions before I keep going? Going once, going twice. All right, get back into it. All right. Now we get into nitty gritty, reading the zoning resolution, and not necessarily the resolution, but just the districts, right? So we basically have 3 types of districts that are in New York City. You would think that's kind of wild considering all the variety that we have, but it comes from what we call Euclidean zoning, which I'll spare you all the planning history, but it basically comes down to three main use districts, and then we could see what's allowed in those districts below. So there's R, residential district, C is a commercial district, and an M is a manufacturing district, right? Pretty straightforward. But what's not straightforward is the fact that residential districts can sometimes allow commercial districts can sometimes allow residential, manufacturing districts can never allow commercial, but can sometimes allow, or can never allow residential, but can sometimes allow commercial. So there's mixes and matches throughout those. But really what these first letters of every zoning district is, indicates kind of the intention for that district, right? A commercial district can certainly allow residential buildings in most cases, but the intention is for it to really be a thriving commercial area. If it allows residential, that's great. We love a mixed use area where people can walk to work, walk to where they shop. That's great, but it's really a commercial area, right? A residential district with the commercial overlay, which I'll get to in a minute, is really intended to be a residential district, and the shops and the restaurants and anything else are really there to support those local residents. And so that's kind of the gist. So when you see a zoning district, you can just look at the first letter and you can see kind of the general intention there. Number two is you are going to see a number, right? So in R6, we've got here C24 and 12, right? Just look at the second number, and that usually describes the intensity or the density, right? There's something that you see, you know, so for instance, residential districts go from R1, you know, with a suffix, which we'll get to in a minute, all the way up to an R10, right? The R1s and 2s and 3s are some that are found in Staten Island, some are found in Bay Ridge, and some in the more suburban areas in the periphery of the city, right? That aren't really, you know, in the depths of Manhattan. We go to, you know, the opposite ends of the spectrum. When you get to Manhattan, you'll see a lot of R8, R9, R10 districts, right? And in other parts of Brooklyn too, you'll see R6, R7, and R8 quite a bit into some of those medium density districts. C24, you see the word overlay right there next to the word intensity. That's because, and actually if you look at this chart below, you can see there's those two arrows that say overlays and districts below, right? That's because, like I described earlier, in certain residential districts, there are commercial overlays, and those are, you can see in that red box. That kind of goes back to what I was saying previously. These are typically places, and you can kind of think, I'm, you know, thinking locally to your district, 3rd Avenue or 5th Avenue, right, are pretty good examples, right? They're thriving retail corridors for sure, but they're really not destinations for people from the entire region to come. They're really meant to be there to support the local residents, right? They're a lot of, I mean, I love the places I've gone there, and they're really lovely, like local shops, and usually there's residential buildings all around them, and then the stores and the retail and whatever are usually at the ground floor. We're not trying to see office buildings here, right? That's not really what we're trying to do. And then you got retail and commercial, and people are obviously, you know, come from all over the city for some of them. But really it's mainly a residential district with, you know, some bars, some restaurants, some shops and things like that. You're not going to see a whole lot of office buildings. And that's what you'll see in a commercial overlay district. In your commercial districts, it's a little bit different. You're allowed a lot of the same things as you're allowed in a residential district with a commercial overlay, but it's a little bit more permissive in terms of what kinds of commercial activity is allowed and where that commercial activity can be located. When you get to a commercial district, you're actually allowed to build buildings with commercial above the first 2 floors. You're allowed to actually build an office building or a retail building or something like that. You're allowed to put residential there if you want to. You're allowed to have a mixed building. But those are districts where we're mapping and we're saying, hey, this can actually be a commercial destination, and there can be, you know, big retail places and office buildings. Good example of this is, of course, 86th Street, right? You'll see some residential there, especially on those side streets, but on 86th Street itself, especially the south side, that's a C24A district, and that is really intended to be commercial, right? And that's kind of the commercial center of that neighborhood. This chart below And then manufacturing, actually allows a lot of commercial uses. And it also kind of goes up to use group 17 and 18, which are more manufacturing. But don't be fooled. Some of those manufacturings are not always the big, smokestack type things. A lot of times they're something like t-shirt printing or software engineer, production or something like that. So a lot of times those M1 districts are a little bit less noxious. They don't, have fumes or, hurt the soil or anything like that. But this chart is something that you could find again in the zoning handbook. Highly recommend downloading it. And it shows you what use groups have uses that are allowed in each district. Right. And I can get into more use groups a little bit later, but I realize I spent a lot of time in this slide, so I'm going to move on. All right. And then we get to the third letter or number, depending on your district, right? So let's start with our districts, residential districts, R6A. Now, do you remember earlier I was talking about non-contextual districts versus contextual? This is where that suffix comes in. So what you may see in Brooklyn is you'll probably see a fair amount of R6 districts, and there's no letter at the end of it. Those are our non-contextual districts. Those are left over from the 1961 rezoning of kind of the whole city, or they were zoned that way for whatever reason, but either before 1987 when we introduced the contextual option, or afterwards for whatever reason, right? Those are non-contextual districts. They have that kind of plane that I introduced earlier. But what you'll see much of the time is a contextual district, which is an R6A or an R6B or an R7D or an R8X. Anytime you have a letter following the number in your residential districts, you go, that's contextual. Now, how it falls within the context depends on what that letter is, but you just know that it is a contextual district, which means it's got its base height, its setback, and its max height. None of this, plain stuff. In commercial district, there's usually a dash after the second number and then the third number. And that really doesn't tend to do much to the district besides describe parking or loading. And the difference here is as you go higher in that third number or that third element, which is the number in the C24 case that we see here, actually less parking is required, right? So again, this is something that you tend to see in places with really, really, really good transit access, where people a lot of times don't have ownership, don't have car ownership. A lot of times in our central business districts, whether it be in Flushing or Midtown or in FiDi or downtown Brooklyn or sometimes in Williamsburg too, you'll see a C24 district, which does not require a lot of parking, or as you go higher and higher up, sometimes no parking at all. Meanwhile, like a C21 or a C22 would require some parking, and that's intended for places where we want commercial activity, but we know that folks are going to need to park their cars somewhere, and so we require some more parking, right? On the right side, M12 district, right? These are for manufacturing districts, and they tend to do the same thing with density parking and loading, right? So you could see on the table below, we have M11 districts going all the way up to M15. You know from an M that it's a manufacturing district. You know from the first letter 1 or the first number 1 that it's more of a low, not as impactful, right? Industrial uses. These are the things that are technically industrial uses, but they're not really producing fumes or gases or, doing anything to the soil, nothing like that. But you're allowed to build more of it as that second number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 gets higher, right? So you see the industrial FAR gets greater and the parking gets lower as you increase that third element there. In this green box, you see a mix of uses. So I already talked about commercial overlays, right? You'll see a lot of places that are R6A, C24. That's an R6 district. It's a residential district. That's the main intention, but we want to have that local retail feel. So we map a C24 overlay. You'll see a commercial district like a C64. That's a pretty high density district because the 6 right there is pretty up there. And then 4 is a relatively high number. So there's not a lot of parking, right? A C64 is something you'd find in a major commercial district. Sometimes we'll have weird paired districts, right? Manufacturing districts almost never allow residential uses by design. We want to separate those, but sometimes we will allow them, right? An M1 district, and a lot of times you'll see this in, again, like a Greenpoint or a Williamsburg, sometimes in a Bushwick, where there's a lot of manufacturing and industrial uses and activities that we want to maintain and allow those places to thrive. And as long as they, adhere to certain standards, and as long as they're the kind of uses that don't produce, noxious fumes or things that could actually really injure people in close proximity, then we'll allow residential buildings there as well. Then there's M1, 2D districts. I'm not going to go into that. They're pretty rare, especially in CB10. All right. Questions before I get into ULURP. I'm sorry, I have been verbose. I will try to speed through things after that, but I'll go back to the questions. Leon, you have a question. When you have a zoning overlay, do we need to comply with both restrictions of each zone or the most stringent? Yeah, I was wondering if you can elaborate on that. I think I understand what you mean, but I want to give you the opportunity to speak.
Well, I'm looking in, for example, what I've been looking into, like the residential zone with a commercial overlay. So which one wins, right? So obviously the commercial overlay would allow you to build different uses or program, for example, that the residential doesn't allow you to do. But in terms of like developing a project, like do you have to, like, how do you match the two, or do you take the more stringent aspect of the two, or do you go with the overlay, or?
Well, I think it kind of depends what you're talking about. Now, if we're talking about the bulk of the building, let's say, right, how tall you could build the building, for instance, or how far back or anything like that. First of all, in overlay districts, a lot of times those commercial uses are required to be no higher than the ground floor.
Okay.
And in most of the overlays, the FAR, you have kind of a commercial FAR that's allowed, and then a residential FAR, and those numbers are not the same.
Okay.
Usually the residential FAR is greater, right?
Okay.
And the commercial FAR is lower. You cannot add those on top of each other.
So what do you do? Do you just take the higher one?
Yes. So what you can do, and what you'll see in a lot of cases, is, let's say you have a residential FAR that is 2.0, right? To go back to our previous one. And then you have a commercial FAR that is 1.0, which is actually quite common in lower density districts with overlays, right? You can't add the 2.0 residential and the 1.0 commercial and say, oh, we're going to build a 3.0 FAR building. That is not allowed. What you have to do is kind of fit, if you want to do this, you don't have to build a commercial and an overlay, but it's encouraged, is you can kind of fit your commercial within that maximum 2.0. So basically you find the higher FAR in those sorts of districts, then all your uses can fit into there. If that
Got
makes
it.
sense.
Yeah. That's kind of what I meant. And in some cases, parking is going to be a big one, right? Like commercial may have a different parking ratio. Like what do you do that? Like if your commercial has like a lower ratio than your residential, do you just then take your I'm just thinking like a developer, then you take the lower kind of ratio essentially.
Well, no, it's for whatever you're building, right? So you can have, let's say in this district, you're required to have one space per every unit, let's say, right? Which kind of rare, but not necessarily lower districts. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's one space for every unit for the residential. And then the commercial, it's usually by square footage of commercial, right? Let's say you're in this district and you say, you know what, I know I'm allowed to build commercial, but I don't want to. I just want to build a residential building. Then forget about the commercial requirements. You just need to build one space for every unit. Let's say you build a duplex, 2 spaces, easy.
Got it.
Let's say you want to build commercial as well. Usually the commercial parking requirements are 1 space for every X square feet of commercial floor area.
Right.
So then you do need to add those on top of each other, and it's kind of separate, right? You can put them in the same place, obviously.
Got it. So you the residential,
let's say,
the residential aspect would stay within the residential parameter of the one to one and one out, and then the commercial would, if you're providing 1,000 square feet, divided times the ratio will give you that. Okay.
Right. So let's say you build a duplex with a little commercial on the ground floor, 900 square feet of commercial, tiny shop, you would have to, and with the regulations I said before, 1 space for every unit, you would have to build 2 parking spaces and then 3 parking spaces for the shop, because it's 1 per 300 square feet, let's say. That's a lot right there, right? That's 5 spaces. In some districts, you're also, if the parking pencils out to a certain low number, you're actually allowed to waive all your parking.
Got it.
That's usually in medium density and high density districts, but it can happen all over. So there's different regulations for that. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of more complex when you have like probably properties that are straddling like multiple zones or something. But
Yeah.
but for that, I guess we will
Let's,
hire like a land
yeah.
use attorney. I mean, that's a
I don't know how late you want to be.
yeah.
So I'm happy to continue talking to you about that.
David, David,
Yes.
I don't have so much of a question as I do of a description of a predicament that we're having. First of all, let me say that our district office could not be more astute or research savvy and experienced. And the committee has a number of people with expertise as well. The situation as I see it, and perhaps my fellow members agree and perhaps not, that we're experiencing lately is a problem with as of right projects. As of right projects in general lately, in many circumstances, are inappropriate in our opinion, in use and in density. But the as of right blessing has been granted by the zoning by New York City, and there's kind of nothing we can do about it. And this actually connects with my question to you in the beginning of how often do you review whether what is as of right is actually working? So as I said, it's not a question, it's really more of a frustration. And it's a frustration because the face of our neighborhood is changing in a way in many areas that we don't like. And we feel helpless kind of to object to as of right projects. I don't know if my fellow members agree with this point of view. What do you think?
I'll leave others to speak if they'd like to.
Definitely agree with you.
Yeah. So I just raised that so that maybe we can discuss it further, or you can think about it and
No,
perhaps shed some light on the subject.
frankly,
maybe not now. Well, I know you have a lot to cover, but I just wanted to share it.
that's fine. I'll say right off the bat, you're correct in that if a building is coming forward as of right, that's what the word means, right? That's as of right. I, as a property owner, have that right to build that, right? The intention with our zoning here is to say, here's the envelope. Here's the envelope of what's allowed, right? That's kind of our opportunity, either as a city, as a community board, as a people of all those stakeholders to come together and say, we understand things will change in the future, but these are our regulations, and you can build something within this envelope. What it sounds like you're discovering is that some of those envelopes are not exactly what you signed up for, right? Or not exactly what you're a big fan of. That's fine, and that's okay. And this is the right avenue, or one of the correct avenues to voice that. And I definitely hear that concern. It's legal to rezone down and to downzone places that you think allow too much. And that actually happened quite a bit, particularly during the Bloomberg administrations. The reason that you see a little bit less of that now is because we, as I'm sure you've read, have had a big housing supply problem. And so it's politically a little bit difficult to say, we don't want to allow as much housing. I'm not voicing an opinion on that necessarily right now, but I am saying you can voice those concerns, and I would encourage you to do so because that's your role as community board members. But the reason that you tend not to see a lot of those downzonings is because it is a little difficult in the current climate where we have such a dearth of supply of housing units to meet the residents. But I do hear your concern, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Okay.
Great. I will move on and reshare my screen.
If I could say something, David,
Please.
what would help us, and I don't think it exists, is if there were a way that we could object to some particular project that is as of right. And I don't really think we have a mechanism to do that.
Not through DCP, that's correct. But that then again is then the project's not as of right. Right, then the zoning kind of loses its point, which is fine, right? There are other systems in which that's permitted. Again, going back to San Francisco, where I worked previously, there was that allowance where you could kind of object to an as of right project, and it happened quite a bit. That's not the case in New York. There have been other proposals to kind of bring that up a little bit more. But that's not, then it wouldn't be an as of right project, which is fine. There's no law that says we need to have that necessarily, but I think that the intention of the zoning resolution and the processes that we have is that we're kind of building a vision, and a vision may not get specific, right, into exactly how things are, but it's an overall vision for, okay, if you're in this area or on this block, you can build within this envelope, right? And then a lot of buildings that you see within the district, as I'm sure you're discovering, are actually built far below what they could be built, which is fine, right? A lot of people own their properties and they say, I don't care that I can build higher. I just like my property as it is. But other people want to build higher, and they're permitted to. So, having objections to as of right buildings, we've heard that before, and that's legitimate. I understand that. I mean, I've been in that situation too, where I've been a little confused as a building going across the street or something. But that's just, that's not the way that it's necessarily set up in New York.
Thank you.
That's all I can say.
Thank you.
Right. I will get back to the sharing. Oh, that was just questions. We got that. All right. Let's go into ULURP here. So we're going to start with just what DCP can do, right? So what I do as my role as a Brooklyn, planner is to review land use environmental applications and make sure they provide accurate information. That's the most important thing, right? They need to be accurate and correct. I need to make sure that applications are consistent with our citywide policies and zoning regulations, right? It's easy to check whether they're consistent with the zoning regulations necessarily, because it's just black and white, right? Do you meet the FAR? Do you meet the height limits? Yes, no. Okay, simple. But our citywide policies are different, right? Policies change over time. What we were trying to do in 1961 or 1965 is not necessarily what we're trying to do in 2010, because the problems and solutions change. And as I mentioned previously, we don't have a comprehensive plan in the city of New York or a general plan. And so our citywide policies are sometimes a little bit fluid, but generally, are pretty straightforward from like era to era, so to speak. And then we need to make sure that we fully inform the decision makers as they make the recommendations and they do the actual votes, right? I have no role in voting. That's not my job. I simply prepare the applications. I make sure they fit. I make sure that they meet, our policies. And if they don't meet our policies or our goals, then I need to let the decision makers know that. And decision makers, of course, are the City Planning Commission and the City Council. They don't have recommendations to make. They have the actual voting power, and the mayor in certain situations, right? So let me get to ULURP itself. For those of you who are involved in ULURP, you know it very, 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 very well. For those of you who are not, that's fine. Let's talk about it. So we have most of my work, quite frankly, in DCP's work of an application. Not most of it, but a good chunk of it happens actually before ULURP begins. The theory being that if an application is thought to be really good, and the community board likes it, the borough president likes it, the council approves it, the commission approves it, we've already done the work, right? In terms of environmental review and land use review, making sure it meets policy, stuff like that. That's our job before public review. Then what happens after the what we call the pre-certification process, which is just me doing, that work, and DCP kind of doing the review, basically saying, in case the city council and the commission voted it, we're good to go. The application is certified. That happens at a review session every other Monday with the City Planning Commission. Those are all live on YouTube. You can watch it. But the certification is just a courtesy to the commission and to the public to let them know, hey, this application is certified to begin public review. The commission can ask me questions, but they cannot vote on anything. There's no vote to be had, right? It's just an introduction to the project as it stands at that point, right? After that, then it goes to y'all, right? Then it's the community board's turn, and you have 60 days to review it. That is when your clock begins, is at certification, or usually a couple days thereafter. The community board has 60 days to review the application. You can issue a recommendation on the application. Let's go to something like this, right? So the application, for instance, you can recommend approval, you can recommend denial, you can recommend approval with conditions. You know, we'll approve it if they do X, Y, and Z. You can also recommend disapproval with conditions. We disapprove it specifically because of X, Y, and Z. You have, you know, your leeway to make recommendations there, right? You can make recommendations on the rezoning boundary. You think they're trying to rezone too much or too little. You think the district is too much or too little, right? But you can also make recommendations on height, on mix of uses, on facade, on developer-sponsored improvements, etc. I do want to note here that we recommend that the community board is as explicit as possible in the specific reasons that you recommend approval, or more importantly, denial of something. If you recommend disapproval of something, it can be difficult for the applicant, for DCP, for anyone else to kind of look and say, what are the actual problems here? And maybe how can we solve them? If you just say we disapprove. If you say we disapprove and you give specific reasons why, that really helps kind of everyone. And it is very clear, not only for the specific project at hand, but also for future developers or homeowners in your neighborhood to know what your feelings are on specific sorts of projects. So I just want to kind of plug that there. CB10 has been pretty good at that, but there are other districts that just, you know, are not. So I want to issue a whole thing. We recommend making recommendations and voicing your concerns on all recommendations, however you see fit. I do want to note that there are some things that we are not able to control, and those can end up being private agreements kind of between a community board or a members and the developer themselves that are outside of our review, right? Really, all we're doing in rezoning applications is we're drawing lines on a map and redrawing them, right? So if you have an issue with the windows or the specific design, that kind of falls out of our purview. That's okay. You can still issue a recommendation saying we don't like it because of the design. The CPC can't necessarily help there. The developer could make an agreement with you. You could sign a legal document for something like that, for instance, but that's just out of the CPC review. I just want to make that clear. But again, recommends, you know, being as clear as you want to be with any recommendations that you have, either in support or in disapproval. We can look at some past projects that you've had in the districts, right? Some of y'all will remember some of these. There's a rezoning on 5th Avenue quite recently. And there was a rezoning on 13th Avenue in which they didn't actually want to build something. All they wanted to do was legalize something, right? That's something that we see quite a bit, where we have buildings that were built a long time ago, sometimes before even 1961. And what they are now is they're kind of grandfathered in. You know, when we change the zoning, we don't force everything that doesn't meet the zoning to tear down their building immediately. They're what we call legally non-conforming or non-complying. And that was the case here in legalizing this one-story office building. They kept the residential district and added a commercial, right? Just want to add a couple that may trigger your memories in the district. This goes back to everything I was talking about previously, right? This, of course, those of you who have been on the committee or the board for a while know this kind of form very well. And wanted to point this out again, attach any further explanation. You can attach as long the explanation as you want. And quite frankly, the longer the better if you see it fit, right? If there's many things that you'd like to discuss about the project, that helps us quite a bit. And when I say us, I don't mean DCP necessarily. It helps every stakeholder here. It helps the borough president understand your concerns more clearly. It helps the city council member understand your concerns more clearly. It helps the commission. It helps the applicant, him or herself, understand the concerns more clearly, right? So I'm going to go back a little bit and go to this process. After the community board, you issue your recommendation on the form noted. It then goes to the borough president, right? Antonio Reynoso, now the borough president. He then has 30 days to review the application and usually has at least one hearing of his own. So even if you can't make a community board hearing, you could always go to the borough president hearing. Even if you did make the community board hearing, you could also go to the borough president hearing. Then it goes to the City Planning Commission, and they have 60 days to review it, right? The community board and the borough president only have recommendation roles, and those recommendations are very powerful and important. The City Planning Commission is the first in this process that actually has a voting role, right? They're not making a recommendation, they're actually making an important decision, right? So they will have hearings of their own. So you, if you want to, can go to community board hearing, and you can hold more than one if you want to, however many you want in that 60 days. The borough president hearing, a city planning commission hearing, right? You have a lot of opportunity to kind of voice your recommendations. The city planning commission approves something, it then goes to the city council, and the council will review it. And then if the city council denies something, it could go to the mayor, who can veto it, but I'll kind of leave that out as it's a relatively rare situation. And so I will go back to city-led actions, and this is basically what I'll finish up with. Some of you are familiar, as I discussed earlier, with public applications. Like I said, most are private applications, but we have some DCP-led actions. That was the Gowanus rezoning that many of you are familiar with. The Soho NoHo rezoning, right? Upcoming actions, M-Crown is something that Councilmember Crystal Hudson has decided to, move forward with along Atlantic Avenue and the surrounding areas, and community boards 3 and 8. So that could be an action that comes in the future after a long period of kind of public review and input. And of course, Mayor Adams' blueprint, his City of Yes initiative, includes 3 zoning text amendments, which are upcoming, but not very soon. You will have plenty of time to kind of talk about that. And in fact, the zoning for economic opportunity, for zero carbon, for housing opportunity, these are actions in which we are trying to be collaborative at the beginning stages, right? And so what we're doing internally with DCB right now is just simply doing research about this stuff. We have not put any specifics into text or into ink. We want to do a lot of outreach and make sure that even before the ULURP process begins for any of these text amendments, we made sure that they are done in full collaboration with the community boards, right? And so those are 3 that are coming up, and those are going to be citywide amendments, right? And that is all I've got. That went really long. I'm sorry, I can get verbose, can't I? But I will leave it there. And I will leave time for any additional questions or comments folks have.
Do we have questions or comments?
I have a question, and
Yes, go ahead.
David, thank you very much. It's about rezoning, either up zone or down zone a street. For example, 4th Avenue. It's been up zoned recently. Now, the question here is, what triggers the up zone? Is it the public? Is it developers, or it's planned? It's the city planning plans for.
The application is submitted either by a private actor, right? A developer, usually working with a land use attorney, whatever, or it can be a city-led action. It's one of those 2 things, right? So it really depends on the situation. It can be either or, depending.
No, the city. What are, like, what triggers the upzone? I mean, is it populations? Is it the growth of?
I see. I understand. Right. So usually for the private applications, it's because they want to build something. Right. It's kind of pretty straightforward. For the city applications, it's where we recognize an area has potential that's typically untapped, right? That's what's been happening recently. However, if you look back in the history of public-led rezonings, which you can see on Zola, which unfortunately I won't have time to get to today, but I'm happy to come back at a later time to demonstrate that really effective tool. There have been rezonings spurred by community boards like yourself, voicing their concerns that certain developments are out of scale, and certain mid blocks have been downzoned, right? That was the case in a lot of neighborhoods. Particularly, there were a lot of them in the Bloomberg under the Bloomberg administration and prior, right? In an area such as Soho NoHo, for instance, which was a city-led application, that's an area that's a really wealthy, predominantly white part of the city, and something that was a goal of the de Blasio administration and a goal of DCP kind of after that was making sure that that is not an exclusive neighborhood, right? That is only for the wealthy and only for, a wealthy group of people. We wanted to expand opportunity for housing in that area because we wanted to implement mandatory inclusionary housing, which requires a certain percentage of buildings has low income and affordable units. And B, we found that it was a really great place to do it because it's right in the middle of Manhattan, right? It's very transit accessible and easy for a lot of people to get to work. So it serves a lot of purposes, right? It cuts down on emissions from driving in because we're upzoning kind of in a place that's already very dense in Manhattan, right? And so that's an example there. So it can be brought by a number of different factors, really, just kind of whatever the initiative is and whatever the longer term policy goal we're trying to accomplish in DCP-led rezonings.
If I could add something specifically for Fourth Avenue, my understanding is that was by the city to allow greater residential development by increasing the height that was allowed.
That maybe I haven't done the research, but I trust you on it.
I'm fairly certain that's what that Fourth Avenue was about.
And I see you speaking. Unfortunately, you're
And you're
muted.
Any other questions or comments is my question.
And I just wanted to, on behalf of Doris, I know we went right into the meeting, but to welcome, we have 3 new board members that are sitting on this committee, have joined the committee for the first time. So I just want to give a shout out to Leah Dan Castillo, Ibrahim Ansi, and how do I say your name? Am I correct? I don't want to say it improperly, and Carmelo Di Bartolo. So welcome to the Zoning and Land Use Committee.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Welcome.
David, thank you so much for tackling 2 very complex issues and for making the highlights and the intent of these 2 topics so clear. And thank you for answering the questions so honestly. And lastly, may we consider you a resource for our work?
Yes, absolutely. I am a planning nerd. I love talking about this stuff. It's really fascinating. I will put my email and my phone number in the chat right now. Make sure that everyone can see it. Hold on one second. It's a funny thing. My email is now, you should see it there, dweissglass@planning.nyc.gov. A lot of dots involved there. You would think they'd come up with something a little more simple, but no, that's not the case. I'll give you my phone number as well. Right now, I'm actually located in the Manhattan office. You can see behind me. They're renovating our Brooklyn office. So I have a different phone number right now. That's why I have to look over. And yes, absolutely consider me a resource. I love to help out. I really enjoy kind of digging into the complicated nitty-gritty details of that and kind of making them simple as best that I can. And so I really look forward to speaking with you about anything planning related or non-planning related for that matter.
Thank you. Jane Marie or Josephine, did we miss anything?
Yeah, just one last thing for the Zoning and Land Use Committee. So many of the community boards, since we're getting so many new members, many of the boards have been asking for trainings just like this, and we're so glad that David was able to put this together. But the borough president will also be putting together a series of trainings for board members. There's one that I emailed on ULURP that's coming up at the end of the month. So I think that it gives us an opportunity for those who have been on the board for a refresher, and especially as we prepare for those 3 citywide text amendments and any other actions that may come our way in the next few months as a Zoning and Land Use Committee. I think it's helpful. So I do appreciate David as a resource too for the district office, because I call him often, I email him often actually on different issues. So that's it, Anne. I think we're
All right.
done.
Thank you to all. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to
I'll make
adjourn.
that. I'll
Okay.
second that.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have
Thank
a
you. Have a
You're
good
welcome.
evening.
good
Nice
night.
seeing everybody.
Good night.
Thank you all.